everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mark, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me again.
You and I have talked before about exactly where we are in the war between Russia and Ukraine, and I want to talk about that now because earlier this month, President Putin and President Trump had a phone call that lasted over 2 hours. And President Trump characterized that conversation as going very well, and he said this, quote, "Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations toward a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war." But a week and a half after that phone call, as we sit here right now, that really doesn't seem to be the case. There's strikes across both sides, and these attacks really seem to be escalating. So where are we right now in this war?
Yeah, thanks. You have it just right. The war is not ending. There is an extreme mismatch between what President Putin says to President Trump in their conversations and how he acts on the battlefield. I would differentiate this from President Zelensky, who legitimately has attempted to meet President Trump's demands. President Trump ran a pretty tough maximum pressure campaign against President Zelensky and got out of it, concessions that would allow for an immediate ceasefire and then discussions, as well as a critical minerals deal separately with the United States. He has not done the same. President Trump hasn't done the same to President Putin. So as a result, President Putin, says things on the phone call and then acts very differently. And to specifically get at it, there is action going on at the line of contact. It is being initiated by Russia. Russia is attempting to gain land, particularly strategic hamlets and villages, to allow for a further press this summer in a large-scale offensive. And then they're supporting that with significant cruise and ballistic missile strikes and drone strikes against both military positions, but also against Ukrainian critical infrastructure, which is leading to a number of civilian casualties.
And I want to talk about that mismatch a little more of what Putin is saying on the phone, what he's saying to President Trump versus what's actually happening. Because even back in April, President Trump said, "I wonder if Putin is just tagging me along." And that seems to be the case right now because on the phone on May 19th, apparently Putin said that Russia will, quote, "propose and is ready to work with the Ukrainian side on a memorandum on a possible future peace accord." Russia said it's still working on this document, but they are still launching strikes at the Ukrainians. So, I mean, do they really want peace? What does this look like? Is this just a tactic to appease Trump on the phone call? Are they working on this document in good faith? What do you make of this?
No, I don't believe, and I think when we spoke to you, I implied that President Putin has a bad track record of telling the truth and building consensus. He tends to act unilaterally in an authoritarian way and is generally distrustworthy in his negotiations. And I think President Trump's experiencing that. He's trying his hardest. President Trump, I believe him, at his core, he really wants this war to stop. I mean, some of his best texts on this have been like, "Vladimir, stop," right? I mean, he really, I think, passionately wants this war to end. Unfortunately, his passion and his desire is running into Putin's kind of cold-blooded, authoritarian, criminal activity. And so I don't believe, I think we're going to get to the point where President Trump is either going to just abandon the whole effort or come down solidly on the side of Ukraine and help the Ukrainians achieve a stable condition on the battlefield.
And to your point that earlier, and a point you made 2 months ago, is that the United States was putting a maximum pressure campaign on our ally Ukraine, and they weren't really doing the same for Russia. Now it seems like President Trump is changing his tone when it comes to Russia and Putin in particular, because he seemed visibly angry when talking to reporters over the weekend. He asked what the hell happened to Putin. He said he doesn't like how Putin's killing people, especially how during the time that the United States and Russia are engaged in peace talks. What are your thoughts on this changing tone from President Trump? And President Trump said he was surprised. I mean, are you surprised?
Well, no, I'm not surprised. And I think I've pretty consistently said, we can't trust Putin. So I'm glad to see President Trump feel this way. It is the way most people feel after interactions with President Putin. Like, you've been misled, you've been duped, or I've been tapped. You know, I'm glad I think he's reaching the right conclusion about Putin. Now I hope he comes up with the right solution to that Putin problem, because I think it's time for the United States to take some action to put a maximum pressure campaign on Russia. We are the most powerful country in the world. We have options, and President Trump can resolve this issue on terms President Trump wants if he were to take action.
And President Trump's reportedly weighing the idea of sanctions against Russia. Do you think that's the only solution to what you're describing as this Putin problem? Do you think there needs to be less of a carrot now with the way the United States is approaching Russia, more of a stick when it comes to Russia? Zelensky's calling for tough sanctions from the United States, from Europe, from around the world on Russia. What do you think those sanctions need to look like?
You're exactly right. It is time for a change. It's two areas. One is sanctions, and the other is military support. So talk about sanctions first. Look, we need to cut off Russia's energy revenues, the money they get from the sale of fossil fuels. And the way we do that is by, crushing the use of the shadow fleet. Those are illegal oilers, tankers used by Russia to circumvent sanctions. We need to lower the G7 oil price cap. That means the price at which Russia is allowed to sell oil to the G7 countries, and then target any other revenue generating commodities that Russia has, but it's mostly fossil fuels. We need to shut down third-party sanctions invasions. That's how these shadow fleets sell things. It's principally in China and India, but there's also some stuff going on in Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. These are all countries that we can influence, particularly Turkey, United Arab Emirates, and India. We need to expand the sanctions against Russia's strategic state-owned enterprises and their high-tech sectors, very directly at Rosatom and Roscosmos, the two big companies that have avoided it so far. And we need to put escalating comprehensive sanctions on its central bank. And then we have to condition any further sanctions relief, which President talks about a lot, on measurable behavior changes by Russia. If we carry out those kind of 5 steps there, we will put a maximum pressure campaign economically on Russia. This is talked about, John Hardy, one of my colleagues here at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, has talked about this in multiple articles. But, I just gave you 5 quick could get at. And to me, that's the sanction side of this problem. There is another side to it, which is military support. Look, my gut feeling is, and I train Ukrainian units and spend some time there. They're not going to lose. They believe their resilience is greater than Russia's resilience. But they will suffer more casualties if the U.S. were to, say, cut off intelligence support, or if the U.S. were to not allow Ukraine or the Europeans to buy from the defense industrial base of the United States. In other words, just so U.S. companies could make money. Those first two are pretty easy lifts for the president. But keep those 2 things in place. And then if he really wants to ratchet the pressure up on President Putin, open up a loan program for Ukraine to do either purchases or presidential drawdown authority and get weapon systems from us that they would have to pay back, but in some distant time, probably using the critical minerals deal that we just made with them. To me, all that stuff together, sanctions plus military support plus potentially a loan program, that's how you bring maximum pressure on Vladimir Putin.
And is there any indication that that's where President Trump is heading? Is he headed to that maximum pressure campaign that you just laid out? Is he headed to maybe a more moderate pressure campaign? What do you think?
So I doubt he'll start with all 5 steps I mentioned, but I think it's likely. Now, look, I've been wrong on this 2 or 3 times because I've heard him say, I'm frustrated. Vladimir, stop, and Vladimir doesn't stop. Normally when this president doesn't get his way, he does something. He's not getting his way, and only one person is stopping him, Vladimir Putin. There's not a Zelensky problem here. I know the president says that once in a while. He doesn't like how Zelensky tweets, but Zelensky's not the problem. The problem is Vladimir Putin. The problem is an authoritarian Russian state, and I think President Trump's at the point now where he'll do some of those 5 steps of sanctions I mentioned.
And the last time I saw President Trump that I can remember that angry when talking about this conflict after this weekend, or before this weekend rather, was during that White House meeting between him, Vice President Vance, and Zelensky, and that got really heated. And you and I talked after that, and President Trump was accused of, just spanking our ally on an international stage while cozying up to the dictator Putin. And it seems like the tides have really changed right now. I want to read something that President Trump posted on social media because it's getting really ugly online. He said this, quote, "What Vladimir Putin doesn't realize is that if it weren't for me, lots of really bad things would have already happened to Russia. And I mean really bad. He's playing with fire." Putin reads that. I mean, what is he thinking? Does he think that's a threat? Is he laughing it off? I mean, what do you think he makes of that?
Well, I hope he thinks it's a threat, because I hope it's a threat. If it's just posturing by President Trump, that would be disappointing. I mean, we're at the point. The United States doesn't get treated like this. I mean, President Trump tends to have a more muscular, theory of how the United States should be treated by other countries in the world, and yet we're being mistreated by Russia. He is being personally mistreated by Putin. I'm surprised he hasn't taken action. I'm disappointed. I mean, there are things the president does that I do and don't like, but I always consistently felt he doesn't get pushed around, and he's getting pushed around. And it's time for him. He has a lot of tools. He's the most powerful leader in the world. He has all these tools at his fingertips, these sanctions tools, these support to Ukraine tools, the ability to loan money to Ukraine or provide weapon systems. He can do all these things. He doesn't have to do all of them all at once, but he needs to do some of them right now. And so I do hope he does.
And I want to read some more posts on social media because from that, I mean, this really devolved. And a Russian security official and a former Russian president posted this, quote, "Regarding Trump's words about Putin playing with fire and really bad things happening to Russia, I only know of one really bad thing, World War III. I hope Trump understands this." And then Keith Kellogg, Trump's special envoy to Ukraine, said this, quote, "Stoking fears of World War III is an unfortunate, reckless comment and unfitting of a world power. President Trump is working to stop this war and end the killing. We await receipt of the memorandum, the term sheet that you promised a week ago. Ceasefire now." What do you make of that back and forth spilling out on social media? And what do you make on this dangling of a World War III?
Well, let's be clear. Medvedev, who said that, is a Putin lackey, right? I mean, he was, Putin used him to step out of the presidency and back in when he had a term limits issue. He says things that I think Vladimir Putin thinks, but probably doesn't want to say. So that was a threat. It's not a realistic threat. We're not going to have a World War III if the United States sanctions Russia over the war in Ukraine. We're not going to have a World War III if the United States allows countries to buy from our defense industrial base to arm Ukraine. And we're not going to have World War III if we do a loan program to help rearm Ukraine. And we're not going to have a World War III if we do all three of those simultaneously. The bottom line is Vladimir Putin's got himself in a jam. He, as a rapacious authoritarian dictator, invaded another country, failed in that invasion, and is being stymied. And it's time for the United States to say enough. And because you won't listen to us when our president politely asks you enough for 3 months straight, now you get the stick. And that stick should bring Vladimir Putin to the table. If it doesn't, it'll make Ukraine strong enough to hold him off indefinitely.
And between now and when President Trump gives Putin that stick, I mean, what specifically are you looking out for?
So I think the first is that, we begin to see there are tools that the president has that he could use to sanction right now. But Senator and others have put together legislation that imposes very strict sanctions. Senator Thune, the leader of the Senate, said, "Hey, look, I'm waiting for a signal from President Trump." So a nice signal here is, hey, Senator Thune, get that thing started. You have my blessing. Get that passed in the Senate. Then Putin knows, hey, sanctions are 2 steps away, a House passage and a signature from the president. That's the way he can signal an intent, a looming intent on the sanctions.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for, but do you think right now, as we sit here, President Trump or the Trump administration is missing anything when it comes to these negotiations? Do you think they're underestimating Russia in any way?
Quite the reverse. I think they've overestimated Russia's willingness to cooperate. I think this is probably predicated on an overestimation of Russia's power. The United States is the big, sometimes you have meetings between countries and there's big countries and other big countries or big countries and small countries. The United States is the big country. Russia's a small country. Russia's economy is like 17th or 18th in the world. They are not a superpower, and an economic superpower. And what worries me is the president's like, this will be great for us. We can have this trade with Russia. There isn't good trade with Russia. Russia sells fossil fuels and Russia sells weapons that we don't want. We don't need the fossil fuels. We don't want the weapons. This is not the economic opening that we need.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for in these continued negotiations, and I hope you come back on and break them down with me. Thank you so much for joining me. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a very good conversation.